My name's Emily McDaniel. I'm a member of the Kalari clan, the Lachlan River clan of the Wiradjuri Nation in central New South Wales. I work as a curator in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art. I grew up in Sydney. I've lived in Sydney all my life, and growing up, Aboriginal art was very much used as a way of communicating cultural identity by my father, who's also a Wiradjuri man. So there was a great sense of comfortability with working with Aboriginal artists. I first started working at the Art Gallery of New South Wales just after I'd finished school, and I actually had no experience in visual art. I knew Aboriginal culture, and so I actually applied that to the artworks, and later on the artworks themselves became the most important part for me. But it was really from having a strong sense of identity and culture. I studied audio production and video production, so I did have a creative education. But best education, I think, when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art is working alongside artists and alongside established curators, and through method of osmosis, absorbing their stories and they become yours. So I think that's the best form of education, and I certainly gained my experience that way. We have one work of Prince of Wales at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where I work as an assistant curator, and that's always been a really special work, and it sits quite uniquely within the collection. It's one of those works where you're never looking for complementary work because it's so unique. You have to acknowledge that it's going to be a centrepiece no matter where you hang it. So I first became aware of Prince of Wales' work through the collection, and I only really started to research his work closely for the No Boundaries catalogue, and I'm glad I got that opportunity because it's made me really understand the responsibility behind his work as an artist and as a Larrakia man. I think that larger work really does relate to the one that we have in the collection. It was done at a time when you could really see his confidence coming out through the way he worked with the canvas and the restraints of it as well, and how he began to position his body marks within the frame. There's a certain similarity between it, and it is that air of confidence that he gained within the last couple of years that he was practicing, and you do see those similarities. In looking at the first two works that he did, they are of a smaller scale, which I understand as being comparable to the surface of a man's torso, and that was obviously the first surface that he became truly intimate with and really begun to understand how line moved with the body during ceremony. So it is of a smaller scale, and also the colour choice is very urgent, is the word I would use. There's a sense of urgency and excitement in the colour selection that he picked and the application. And there's a rhythm that you can see in the way that he paints, and I think that he maintained throughout the whole of his career. So as he began painting and kept on painting, what you see towards the later years of his practice is they got quite larger. They really did. They grew in size, and rather than maintaining that sense of excitement, it was also channeled in a different way. It was considered as well. And his work is quite meditative. There's a sense of mindfulness that I think he carried on throughout the entire work, and it's demonstrated best, I think, in that larger work within the exhibition. You can see that connect between his memories of performing, the rhythm or the music that would have been going through his mind as he's applying. There's a real strong sense of connectedness, and it refines itself toward the end. The end is really a masterpiece. You can read it, you can understand it in terms of sound, music and rhythm. Prince of Wales got his name, well, there are different understandings of it. One of the understandings is that he received his name as his father was referred to as king, and so he may have been understood as a prince. The other possible way that he came to having that name, Prince of Wales, was he performed for Queen Elizabeth during her tour of Australia. And it's a very funny thing because in the essay I have made the decision to refer to him as Midpool, as that was the name that he was given as a young child and grew up. And it's an identity that isn't attached to royalty. It isn't attached to a sense of British royalty, but it's his identity. And that was a mindful decision that I made, but he was understood as a man of many names. I think there's a strong sense of resilience in Aboriginal art. There's a really powerful sense of continuing on. Too often, I think Indigenous culture is pinned as something cemented in time that can't deviate from paths that are considered to be traditional. Otherwise, there's often an assumption that a loss occurs, a loss of culture. In looking at Midpool's work, there was no loss that ever occurred through his entire practice as an artist. And when I say artist, I mean it in all the senses, as a performer, as someone who participated in ceremony and knowledge, and later on in painting. There was no loss that ever occurred in his practice. It just kept continuing in different manifestations. His physical mobility was severely impacted by a stroke. And it was after that stroke, and I'm sure it took a great deal of time to come to terms with the sense of loss of that part of his life. But rather than considering it a loss, he turned it into a gain by painting in new and different ways. Midpool was a really strong Larrakia man and an advocate for Larrakia rights. And that was really inherited from his father, I believe. He was a leader in terms of ceremony, in terms of community connections and passing on knowledge. That was really quite important. In 1977, he was one of the claimants of the Kenby land claim, and understood by the government of that time, he was considered to be a true Larrakia person. So that's a little bit controversial, claiming that there may be untrue Larrakia people. But we can look at that as a way of saying there was an undeniable connection back to country, culture and community for him. Curator Hetty Perkins spoke really interestingly about Midpool's career and likened it to a staccato composition. And I've been really quite interested in that idea of looking at it in terms of this visual score. The rhythm that's applied by the dotting within the surface of the painting. There's a very, you can read the spaces between it. You know? It has an internal logic. As his career matured, these compositions became much more restrained in the way of reading them. There's a sense of loudness with his smallest earlier works, and I think as those canvases increased, interestingly, they didn't become louder, they just became more contained, restrained and refined in a way. White's a funny cue for an artist to use. There's got to be a sense of confidence around it. And in looking at emerging artists, you can tell that there's somewhat of a fear to use white, to leave out rather than add to. And in his earlier days, he added. He added colour upon colour upon colour. As his work progressed, as his career went on, you start to slowly see an experimentation of white, whether that was him actually mixing it into his colour. And then at the end, you finally see him embrace it in all of its glory. And what he was able to do with his use of white was to punctuate, was to add something more to bring out the other colours that he was using. He had a really interesting relationship at the end. His colours were often restricted to blues, reds, whites, and blacks in a way to create a much more dense, inky blue. But within that, what he was allowed to do was to embrace the relationships between the two for what they are. There was a sense of temporary expression in his earlier life experiences as a dancer, as a performer, and so on. But as he did move towards the canvas, his medium of expression became much more permanent. And that's something I think we can consider in the ways of changing realities of Aboriginal people within Australia. You know, I was hearing the other day on a documentary called Art and Soul, and the artist Jonathan Jones said, we didn't become the oldest living group of people by not changing. We have to change and embrace and find new evolutions and expressions of culture. So I think his work was very much attached to his experiences as a person and more broadly within the Larrakia Nation. Times were changing, and so was his work to reflect that at every point in his life. Art for all Aboriginal people operates on many different levels. It is both beautiful. Before we analyse Midpool's work, we need to first acknowledge that it is acrylic paint on a canvas, and it is beautiful. It's an artwork in itself. But there are many layered meanings beyond it. It's a complex idea, but the best way I've found of expressing the depth that can be contained in paintings is it's much like medical or legal terminology. I know the basic paracetamol, I know when I've got a cold. Anything beyond that, I'm not too sure. But that's okay because I'm not a qualified doctor. I don't understand that language and I haven't been through those processes to see it. But I have an idea for my own self where I am and how I understand a painting. And it's very, very similar with artworks by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They have layered meanings. They have different meanings, but I think it's very important for the individual to understand that the way they see it is also a really special, intimate relationship. We look at Midpool's work as an affirmation of culture and identity, as a Larrakia man, as an Aboriginal man. It is paint on a canvas. And I think to not acknowledge that, we're not acknowledging the genius of the artist in himself. Aboriginal artists are aware of the art market. They are aware, and it has a significant influence on the way they produce work. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge that. First and foremost, I look at Prince of Wales' work as beautiful, minimalist, contemporary works. That's the way I read them. Midpool titled all of his works Body Marks, and he was quite firm on that idea. And I know quite often he was questioned, why don't we try something new? And he was very, very firm that he wanted that subject matter to be the title. Body marks can be understood as his first experimentation of painting on the body for ceremony, painting up a male body. And it was primarily the torso is where the centre of focus was. So we see that as he transferred to those smaller canvases, he maintains that sense of a compact surface in a way. So body marks do relate back to the physical sensibility of movement with paint. And that idea of his original canvas being able to move, I think after he started to move toward painting, he still maintained a sense of movement in a way. I really love that he called all of those works body marks, because it perfectly illustrates a very complex idea that you can have many different manifestations, many different visual representations, but it all comes back to the one idea. And body marks is not just about the body, it is about community, culture and history as a whole. Indigenous culture is terribly interconnected. Everything relates to one another. And without that link, it falls to pieces. So by saying that body marks is everything, it's encompassing all of those details. Ancestors before, the people that will be after Midpool. It encompasses the spiritual world, the physical world, all in one mark. So every time he made a mark on the canvas, it was recalling and reconnecting to that broader sense of culture.